December 7th, a date which will live in infamy, and one of the most important dates in United States military history. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor was a surprise military strike against the U.S. naval base in Hawaii. Launching at 7:48 a.m. on a Sunday morning, 353 Japanese aircraft struck in two waves, targeting the Pacific Fleet's battleships and airfields. The attack killed 2,403 Americans and wounded 1,178 more. 8 battleships were damaged or destroyed, including the USS Arizona, which remains at the bottom of the harbor as a memorial. However, the U.S. aircraft carriers were at sea and escaped damage, a fact that would prove crucial in the coming war. The attack brought the United States into World War II and set the stage for the heroic battles that took place in sea and in air in the Pacific theater. Today, we're going to go through some of the most defining naval battles of this war, including the Battle of Coral Sea, which was the first military battle between aircraft carriers, and ending with the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history and the first battle in which the desperate Imperial Japanese Navy used organized kamikaze attacks. Hello, and welcome to Deadliest Disasters. The Japanese attack force that approached Pearl Harbor in the early morning hours of December 7, 1941, represented one of the most audacious military operations in history. Admiral Nagumo's task force consisted of 6 aircraft carriers escorted by 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, 9 destroyers, and 3 submarines. The strike force had sailed from Hitokapu Bay in the Kuril Islands on November 26, taking a northern route across the Pacific to avoid detection by American patrol aircraft and ships. The tactical plan, conceived by Admiral Yamamoto, was elegantly simple in its conception, but extraordinarily complex in its execution. 2 waves of attacks would target the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, with the primary objectives being the destruction of American battleships and aircraft carriers, the elimination of American air power at Oahu, and the destruction of fuel storage and repair facilities that would prevent the Americans from mounting an immediate counterattack. The first wave, consisting of 183 aircraft, was launched at 6 a.m. from a position approximately 230 miles north of Oahu. Led by Commander Fuchida, the strike force included 49 Kate bombers armed with specially modified 16-inch armor-piercing shells converted into aerial bombs, 40 Kate torpedo bombers, 51 Val dive bombers, and 43 Zero fighters. The aircraft approached Oahu from the north, using the island's mountains to mask their approach until the final moments. At 7:55 a.m., Commander Fuchida transmitted the code phrase, "Tora Tora Tora," to the Japanese fleet, indicating that complete tactical surprise had been achieved. What followed was a carefully choreographed dance of destruction that would last for nearly 2 hours and transform the strategic balance of the Pacific War. The battleships of the Pacific Fleet, moored along the southeast shore of Ford Island in what would forever be known as Battleship Row, presented perfect targets for the Japanese torpedo bombers. The USS Oklahoma was struck by at least 4 torpedoes in the first minutes of the attack, causing the 29,000-ton battleship to capsize completely, trapping over 400 sailors inside her hull. Many of these men survived the initial attack, but drowned slowly as the ship settled into the harbor mud, their desperate hammering on the hull heard by rescue workers for days afterward. The USS Arizona suffered an even more catastrophic fate. At approximately 8:06 a.m., a 1,700-pound armor-piercing bomb dropped from a Kate bomber at an altitude of 10,000 feet penetrated the ship's forward magazine. The resulting explosion was so massive that it lifted the entire forward section of the battleship out of the water and broke the ship's back. The explosion killed 1,177 of the Arizona's 1,400-man crew instantly, making it the single deadliest moment of the attack. Sailors on nearby ships reported that the blast was so powerful it knocked men off their feet hundreds of yards away, and the mushroom cloud rose over 500 feet into the air. The USS West Virginia, moored outboard of the Tennessee, was struck by at least 7 torpedoes and 2 bombs. Captain Mervyn Bennison, mortally wounded by shrapnel from a bomb hit on the nearby Tennessee, remained at his post directing damage control efforts until he died. The ship settled evenly into the harbor bottom, preventing it from capsizing like the Oklahoma, but not before 106 of her crew perished in the attack. The USS California, flagship of the Pacific Fleet, was struck by 2 torpedoes and a bomb. The ship might have survived these hits, but damage control efforts were hampered by the fact that many watertight doors had been left open for a scheduled inspection. As water poured through the ship's compartments, she slowly settled by the stern, taking 100 of her crew with her to the bottom of the harbor. The USS Nevada, the only battleship to get underway during the attack, became a magnet for Japanese bombs and strafing runs as she attempted to escape the harbor. Recognizing that a sinking ship in the harbor channel would block it completely, the Nevada's commanding officer deliberately beached his ship at Hospital Point. Despite suffering extensive damage and casualties, the Nevada's gallant attempt to sortie became one of the most heroic episodes of the attack. While the battleships bore the brunt of the Japanese assault, the attack extended far beyond Battleship Row. At the nearby airfields, Hickam Field, Wheeler Field, Bellows Field, and the naval air stations at Ford Island and Kineo Bay, Japanese fighters and bombers systematically destroyed American aircraft parked in neat rows on the ground. The peacetime practice of parking aircraft wingtip to wingtip made them perfect targets for strafing runs. Of the approximately 390 American aircraft on Oahu, 188 were destroyed and 159 damaged, effectively eliminating American air power in the Hawaiian Islands. The human cost of these attacks was devastating. At Hickam Field, a direct bomb hit on the mess hall killed 35 airmen who were eating breakfast. At Wheeler Field, strafing attacks on the barracks killed and wounded dozens of pilots and ground crew members. The attacks on the airfields were particularly brutal because they targeted not just military equipment, but also the personnel needed to operate it. The second wave of the attack, consisting of 167 aircraft, arrived over Pearl Harbor at approximately 8:40 a.m. By this time, American forces had recovered from their initial shock and were putting up fierce resistance. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky over Pearl Harbor, and a few American fighters that had managed to get airborne engaged the Japanese attackers. The second wave focused primarily on ships that had escaped damage in the first attack, as well as the harbor's fuel storage facilities and dry docks. However, the second wave commander, Lieutenant Commander Shimazaki, made a crucial decision that would have far-reaching consequences for the Pacific War. Despite orders to target the fuel storage tanks and repair facilities, most of the second wave's attention was focused on ships and aircraft, leaving the harbor's infrastructure largely intact. The massive fuel storage tanks at Red Hill, containing over 4.5 million barrels of oil, were left untouched. Similarly, the dry docks and repair facilities that would prove crucial to the American recovery were largely undamaged. When the last Japanese aircraft disappeared over the horizon at approximately 9:45 a.m., Pearl Harbor resembled a scene from hell. The harbor water was covered with a thick layer of oil that burned for hours, creating towering columns of black smoke that could be seen for miles. The smell of cordite, burning oil, and death hung heavy in the tropical air, while the sounds of dying men echoed across the water. The human toll was staggering. A total of 2,403 Americans died in the attack, with another 1,178 wounded. Even civilians were not spared. 68 died and 35 were wounded, mostly from anti-aircraft shells that fell in Honolulu. The material losses were equally devastating. 18 warships were sunk or severely damaged, including 8 battleships, 3 cruisers, 3 destroyers, and 4 auxiliary vessels. The battleship losses were particularly severe. Arizona and Oklahoma were total losses, while California and West Virginia were sunk but later raised and repaired. Nevada, Tennessee, Maryland, and Pennsylvania all suffered varying degrees of damage but were eventually returned to service. The destruction of American aircraft was nearly complete. Of the 390 aircraft based on Oahu, 188 were destroyed and 159 damaged. This left the Hawaiian Islands essentially defenseless against follow-up attacks, a vulnerability that would persist for months. Yet, for all its tactical success, the Pearl Harbor attack contained the seeds of Japan's ultimate strategic failure. The most crucial American assets, the aircraft carriers and the fuel storage facilities, escaped destruction. The Enterprise and Lexington were at sea while the Saratoga was on the west coast. These carriers would form the backbone of America's Pacific offensive, playing decisive roles in the Battle of Coral Sea, Midway, and beyond. Perhaps more importantly, the attack on Pearl Harbor accomplished what no amount of political rhetoric or international incidents had managed to achieve. It united the American people behind the war effort. The isolationist movement, which had been a powerful force in American politics throughout the 1930s, collapsed overnight. American First rallies were canceled, and isolationist senators found themselves voting for war declarations they had opposed just days earlier. President Roosevelt's address to Congress on December 8, 1941, would become one of the most famous speeches in American history.
December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
Speaking to a joint session of Congress and a radio audience of millions, Roosevelt declared December 7th a date which will live in infamy, and requested a declaration of war against Japan. The speech, lasting just over 6 minutes, concluded with Congress voting 388-1 in the House and 82-0 in the Senate to declare war on Japan. The sole dissenting vote came from a Representative Jeanette Rankin of Montana, a pacifist who had also voted against entry into World War I. The declaration of war against Japan, however, did not automatically bring the United States into the European conflict. That crucial step came 3 days later when Germany and Italy, honoring their obligations under the Tripartite Pact, declared war on the United States. This decision, made personally by Adolf Hitler against the advice of his military commanders, was perhaps one of the greatest strategic blunders of the war. It allowed Roosevelt to pursue his preferred Europe First strategy while ensuring that America would fight a truly global war. Britain's response to Pearl Harbor was immediate and supportive. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who had been courting American entry into the war for over 2 years, reportedly said upon hearing news of the attack, quote, "So we have won after all," unquote. Britain declared war on Japan on December 8th, as did the other dominions of the British Empire: Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa. This created a truly global alliance against the Axis powers, stretching from North America across the Atlantic and Pacific. The attack on Pearl Harbor set in motion a chain of events that would reshape not only the Pacific, but the entire global order. The Pacific War, that began on December 7, 1941, would rage for nearly 4 years, encompass an area larger than all other theaters of World War II combined, and ultimately end with the first and only use of atomic weapons in warfare. Battle of Coral Sea. In the tense weeks after Pearl Harbor, the Pacific bristled with danger. On December 7, 1941, Japan's surprise attack on Pearl Harbor severely damaged the U.S. Pacific Fleet, drawing America into a global war. Japanese forces swept through East Asia, conquering the Philippines, Singapore, and other territories. By spring 1942, their next target was Australia. If Port Moresby and New Guinea fell, Australia's sea lines of communication would be cut off. To block this, the United States and Australia dispatched 2 carrier task forces plus an Australian cruiser squadron. In early May, these fleets converged in the Coral Sea off northeast Australia for an unprecedented fight. But the ships never saw each other. Instead, planes were launched from carriers and over the horizon attacked enemy ships. As a Royal Australian Navy historian notes, this was the first major engagement in which surface vessels neither sighted each other nor exchanged a single shot, with all offenses carried out by aircraft. It took place just months after Pearl Harbor, as the U.S. Navy was still recovering from defeat. By May of 1942, the U.S. Pacific Fleet had few capital ships left. Admiral Ernest King and Admiral Chester Nimitz desperately needed to stop the Japanese advance toward Australia. In early May, Japan launched Operation MO, seized Tulagi and the Solomon Islands, and then Port Moresby and New Guinea, thereby isolating Australia. Against this threat, 2 American task forces sailed north from Australia. Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher commanded the carrier groups from Lexington and Yorktown, while a cruiser force under Royal Australian Navy Rear Admiral John Crace guarded the flanks. On May 3rd through 4th, the Japanese occupied Tulagi and Des Moines. U.S. carrier planes responded with raids on Tulagi Harbor, sinking or damaging Japanese warships ashore. In this preliminary phase, neither side's carriers were within striking range of each other. Both began searching the sea by aircraft. Cruisers and destroyers zigzagged ahead of the carriers as protective screens. The strategic stakes were enormous. Japanese planners later explained they hoped to destroy the U.S. carrier fleet and force America to beg for peace. And U.S. commanders reeling from earlier defeats aimed only to check Japan's juggernaut, buying time to rebuild. By the morning of May 7th, the American carriers were northwest of Tulagi. Japanese carriers Shokaku and Zoikaku lurked to the east. Reconnaissance planes soon spotted the American tanker USS Neosho and her escort destroyer USS Sims far south of the action. Mistakenly identifying Neosho as a carrier, Japanese dive bombers attacked. The cruiser screen scattered, and Sims took multiple hits and exploded, sinking almost immediately. The official Navy report stated that Sims sank with very heavy casualties. Only 15 crew survived in a lifeboat. The rest of Sims' roughly 200 sailors went down with the ship. The Neosho was also struck by bombs and a kamikaze-style crash. With flooding and fires aboard, Captain John Phillips ordered abandon ship. When the survivors later mustered on the rescue ships, Phillips counted 1 officer and 19 men dead and a staggering 4 officers and 154 men missing. In despair, Corpsman Henry Tucker, seeing so many wounded around him, swam between the rafts to tend to the burn victims. He carried nitric acid to treat severe burns and even organized loading the wounded onto lifeboats. Only later did comrades learn Tucker had declined rescue, saying he was of greater use where he was, but unfortunately, he was never seen again. His selfless heroism ended in presumed death among the injured. The horrors of dying at sea are evident here. Men with severe burns, slashes, and broken bones, trapped in oil-slick waters and in tiny boats for days. Medical reports noted that staff treated first and second-degree burns, shrapnel wounds, contusions, and compound fractures as routine. Meanwhile, late morning on May 7th, the Americans found the Japanese covering force, including the light carrier Shoho. Planes from Lexington and Yorktown pounced. In 25 minutes, the pilots unleashed a devastating assault. Multiple torpedo hits and bomb strikes enveloped Shoho. Fires erupted instantly. By noon, she sank by the bow. Among her crew of around 760, 631 men died. Only 131 were picked up from the water, an appalling loss. Shoho's destruction was a rare bright spot for the Allies. It was the first time the Japanese had been beaten in an engagement, according to contemporary reports. Late that day, Japanese air attacks fell on Crace's cruiser group covering Jamard Passage, but caused little damage. Critically, however, Japanese scouts misreported having sighted battleships. Admiral Inoue halted the Port Moresby invasion force until he could verify this phantom threat. In reality, no battleships were there, just Crace's smaller ships, but the misperception spared the Allied flank. By the evening of May 7th, both sides were aware of carrier ships very nearby. The Japanese invasion ships at Port Moresby turned back, stalling the Moresby operation indefinitely. At dawn on May 8th, both carrier forces finally spotted each other some 300 kilometers apart. Vice Admiral Takeo Takagi and Rear Admiral Fletcher each launched massive strikes. Fletcher first sent 75 planes, while Takagi launched 69 airplanes toward the U.S. carriers. The Americans had a brief advantage. Both U.S. carriers carried new radar, giving more warning and time to arm their fighter screens. Nevertheless, both carriers were hit in quick succession. Yorktown took a bomb amidships and a near miss that opened seams in her hull. An oil slick trailed in her wake. Lexington, bigger and slower, fared worse. Around 11:30 a.m., she was struck by 2 bombs and 2 torpedoes in rapid order. Almost immediately after the initial torpedo hit, Lexington's crew began emergency damage control, but then a spark ignited the gasoline vapors leaking from the ship's damaged aviation tanks, according to the senior doctor aboard. This set off an immense explosion and further loss of life. The blast blew holes through Lexington's flight deck, sending up a towering mushroom cloud that engulfed the carrier's bow. Scalding fireballs, burning fuel, and flying shrapnel ripped through the decks. A medic watching the carnage later noted treating dozens of survivors with horrific injuries. First and second degree burns, shrapnel wounds, blast injuries, and even compound fractures. Survivors leapt into the oil-slick sea or clambered into life rafts. Frantic calls for help rose amid the smoke. Shipmates described seeing men burning alive on the flaming deck. Navy records count 216 Lexington sailors killed in the attack, and more than 170 were wounded. Among the fallen were the ship's senior dental officer, killed instantly by a shell, and pharmacist's mate Virgil Weeks, who with complete disregard for his own safety, helped evacuate casualties onto rafts until being struck by shrapnel. Only hours later, Lexington would be declared a total loss. As flames consumed the Lexington, Fletcher ordered the remaining crew off board. He turned his surviving ship southward and at 12:47 p.m. exclaimed, quote, "Fire's not out," unquote. By early afternoon, the Lexington's fires raged uncontrollably. Repeated detonations in the aft magazines tore the ship in two. Finally, at 5:07 p.m., all hands were ordered off and U.S. destroyers hit Lexington by torpedo to ensure she sank. The mighty flat top that had launched hundreds of American planes now slipped beneath the waves. Nearby, Yorktown remained afloat but mortally wounded. She could no longer fight effectively and limped toward Pearl Harbor. Meanwhile, American strikes had their own impact. Shokaku was hit repeatedly by heavy bombs. Explosions tore open her flight deck fore and aft, killing or wounding 223 men on board. Shokaku, too damaged to recover her planes, was forced to withdraw. Suikaku escaped with only splinter damage, but many of her pilots and aircraft had been shot down. Only 46 of Suikaku's 69 planes returned. About a dozen were so badly crippled that they were dumped to sea. Takagi, believing he had sunk 2 U.S. carriers, turned north triumphantly, thinking the battle won. In the raw aftermath, both sides could claim partial victory. The Japanese had sunk a fleet carrier in exchange for their light carrier. From Tokyo's point of view, the exchange seemed favorable, and the Japanese press rejoiced at 2 fleet carriers down for just 1 light carrier. Vice Admiral Inouye later wrote that such a trade was a fair exchange. American public morale sagged at the loss. Lexington's demise was not greeted with happiness by Admiral King and Admiral Nimitz. Official reports tallied U.S. losses. In addition to Lexington's 216 killed, the oiler Neosho lost at least 20 men and many more were missing, and Sims lost almost her entire crew. Planes lost on both sides numbered in the dozens. Yet the larger impact favored the Allies. Port Moresby remained in Allied hands. The Japanese invasion force, spooked by false reports of American battleships and the appearance of burning Shoho, aborted its landing plans. As the Royal Australian Navy history observes, although Allied losses were greater, the invasion of Port Moresby had been stopped. Coral Sea had halted Japan's southern drive, giving Australia a reprieve. Moreover, Shokaku and Zoikaku would miss the crucial Battle of Midway just a month later, a decisive loss for Japan. As a war analyst commented, Temporarily losing the services of these two carriers at Midway was probably much more important than permanently losing Lexington. In the end, Coral Sea was a grueling Allied strategic victory despite a tactical defeat. By delaying Port Moresby, it kept supply lines open and checked Japanese momentum. The carriers Lexington and Yorktown and many brave airmen paid a terrible price, but their sacrifice blunted a Japanese onslaught that had seemed unstoppable since Pearl Harbor. For dozens of young sailors and aviators, the sea became a tomb, burned, broken, and drowned. As one sailor's report notes, discipline held to the end. The gun crews fired until the ship sank, but the wreckage and oil-slicked waves carried haunting proof of the battle's horror. In the end, Coral Sea left an indelible mark. It saved Australia and set the stage for America's next victory at Midway, showing that even in defeat, there can be hope. Battle of Midway. Midway Atoll is a tiny speck of coral and sand 1,300 miles northwest of Honolulu, but it held strategic value far beyond its meager size. For the Japanese, capturing Midway would extend their defensive perimeter and potentially draw the remaining American Pacific Fleet into a decisive battle where superior Japanese numbers could annihilate their enemies once and for all. Yamamoto understood that Japan's industrial capacity could never match America's in a prolonged war. He needed to force a quick, decisive victory while Japan still held the advantage. For the Americans, Midway represented the last line of defense before Hawaii itself came under direct threat. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, knew that losing Midway would leave the west coast of the United States vulnerable to Japanese attack. The psychological impact of such a defeat coming so soon after Pearl Harbor could potentially force America to seek a negotiated peace in the Pacific. The stakes could not have been higher. This was to be a battle not just for a small atoll, but for the future of the Pacific, and perhaps the entire course of World War II. Unknown to Yamamoto, American cryptographers at Pearl Harbor had achieved one of the greatest intelligence coups in military history. Led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, a team of brilliant codebreakers had partially cracked the Japanese naval code JN-25. Through painstaking analysis of intercepted radio transmissions, they had pieced together the broad outlines of Japanese plans for a massive operation against a target designated AF. The Americans suspected AF was Midway, but they needed confirmation. In a stroke of genius, they ordered Midway to transmit an uncoded message reporting that their water purification plant had broken down. Within days, Japanese radio intercepts reported that AF was short of fresh water. The trap was set, and Nimitz now knew exactly when and where the Japanese would strike. This intelligence advantage would prove decisive, but it also meant that American commanders knew they were sailing their men into what could be a massive trap. The weight of that knowledge, sending thousands of sailors and airmen toward almost certain death, would haunt the American leadership as they prepared for battle. Yamamoto's plan was audaciously complex, involving multiple fleet movements across thousands of miles of ocean. The main striking force under Vice Admiral Nagumo included 4 of Japan's finest aircraft carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. These were the same carriers that had devastated Pearl Harbor, and they carried Japan's most experienced pilots, men who had honed their skills in the skies over China and whose expertise in carrier operations was unmatched anywhere in the world. The Japanese force was formidable. 272 aircraft, including the feared Zero fighters that had dominated every air battle since the war began. These pilots were not merely skilled, they were veterans of continuous combat, their survival having honed them into an elite force that American aviators had learned to fear and respect. Against this armada, Nimitz could muster only 3 aircraft carriers: the Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, which had limped back from the Battle of the Coral Sea just days before. The Yorktown in particular was held together by what amounted to emergency repairs: steel plates welded over holes in her flight deck, her fuel tanks patched, and her damaged systems jury-rigged back to functionality. She should have been in dry dock for months. Instead, she sailed to battle with repair crews still working aboard. The American pilots, many of them fresh from training, lacked the combat experience of their Japanese counterparts. What they possessed instead was raw courage and a burning desire for revenge that had been kindling since December 7th, 1941. June 4th, 1942, dawned clear and calm over the Pacific. At 6:20 a.m., Japanese dive bombers and fighters launched from their carriers, bound for Midway Atoll. The first phase of Yamamoto's plan was to soften up the American defenses before landing troops to capture the island. But American radar operators on Midway had detected the incoming strike. Obsolete Brewster Buffalo fighters rose to meet the attackers, their pilots knowing they were flying inferior aircraft against superior enemies. The results were predictably horrific. The Japanese Zeros tore through the American defenders like wolves among sheep. Within minutes, the sky was filled with burning aircraft, their pilots either dead in their cockpits or plummeting toward the ocean in flames. On Midway itself, the Japanese bombing was devastating but not decisive. Hangars erupted in massive fireballs, fuel dumps exploded with earth-shaking force, and American personnel dove for any shelter they could find. The ground shook continuously under the impact of bombs, and the air filled with the smoke of burning aviation fuel and the screams of the wounded. Meanwhile, American torpedo bombers from the carriers had found the Japanese fleet. What followed was one of the most heroic and tragic episodes in naval aviation history. The obsolete TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, slow and vulnerable, pressed their attacks against overwhelming odds. The Japanese fighters fell upon them with merciless efficiency. Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet was virtually annihilated. Of the 15 aircraft that began the attack, only one survived, piloted by Ensign George Gay, who watched in horror from his life raft as his squadron mates died around him. The waters of the Pacific became a graveyard of twisted metal and burning fuel, dotted with the occasional glimpse of a yellow life jacket marking where another American airman had met his fate. As the morning wore on, it seemed as though the Japanese were grinding toward victory. Their airstrikes had damaged Midway, their fighters had massacred the American torpedo bombers, and their fleet remained unscathed. Admiral Nagumo aboard the flagship Akagi began preparing for a second strike against Midway. But at this crucial moment, the Japanese admiral made a fateful decision. Concerned about the American ships reported in the area, he ordered his aircraft to be rearmed from land attack bombs to anti-ship torpedoes. This process would take time, precious time during which the Japanese carriers would be vulnerable, their flight decks crowded with fuel lines, ordnance, and aircraft. At 10:24 a.m., Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading dive bombers from the Enterprise, spotted the Japanese fleet. What he saw below was a target beyond his wildest dreams. 4 enemy carriers in a neat formation, their decks crowded with aircraft being rearmed and refueled. The scene was about to become a vision of hell. McCluskey's dive bombers screamed down from 17,000 feet. The first bomb struck the Akagi near her bridge, the explosion tearing through the ship's vitals. Gasoline vapors ignited in a massive fireball that swept across the flight deck, incinerating everything in its path. Aircraft exploded like firecrackers, their ordnance cooking off in secondary explosions that shook the great ship to her keel. Simultaneously, dive bombers from the Yorktown struck the Soryu. The first bomb penetrated the flight deck and exploded in the hangar, creating a massive conflagration that turned the ship into a floating furnace. Men trapped below decks faced an unspeakable choice: burn to death or jump into the oil-slicked waters where sharks were already beginning to gather, drawn by the blood and chaos. The Kaga, struck by multiple bombs, became a raging inferno. Her captain, realizing the ship was doomed, ordered abandon ship. Sailors jumped from the blazing decks into the sea, many with their clothes on fire, their screams audible even over the roar of the explosions. Those who survived the jump found themselves swimming in a burning fuel oil. The sea itself seemed to be on fire around them. In the space of just 6 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 carriers were reduced to burning wrecks, the cream of the Japanese naval aviation. Experienced pilots who could never be replaced died in those flames, their expertise and training perishing with them in the twisted wreckage of their aircraft. The surviving Japanese carrier Hiryu, commanded by Rear Admiral Yamaguchi, launched a desperate counterattack. Her dive bombers found the Yorktown and scored several hits, starting fires and causing severe damage. American damage control parties found the flames with desperate intensity, knowing that their ship and their lives hung in the balance. The scenes below decks on the Yorktown were nightmarish. Sailors worked in smoke-filled compartments where temperatures soared above 140 degrees Fahrenheit. Men collapsed from heat exhaustion and smoke inhalation, dragged to safety by shipmates who then returned to continue the fight against the fires. The smell of burning metal, fuel, and flesh permeated the ship. Despite their heroic efforts, the Yorktown was severely damaged and listing. Captain Elliot Buckmaster ordered abandoned ship, and hundreds of sailors went into the water. Many would never be recovered, their bodies joining the thousands of others that the Pacific would claim during these 4 days of horror. But the Hiryu's victory was short-lived. Late in the afternoon, American dive bombers found the last Japanese carrier. Like her sisters before her, the Hiryu was caught with aircraft on deck being refueled and rearmed. The American bombs turned her into yet another floating pyre. Admiral Yamaguchi, realizing his ship was doomed, chose to go down with her. As flames consumed the Hiryu, he and Captain Tomeo Kaku sat on the bridge, sharing a final drink as their ship died beneath them. They were last seen singing the Japanese national anthem as the carrier slipped beneath the waves, taking with her the last remnants of the force that had attacked Pearl Harbor. The statistics of the Battle of Midway tell only part of the story. Japan lost 4 aircraft carriers, 1 heavy cruiser, 272 aircraft, and approximately 3,057 men. But these numbers cannot convey the true horror of what those men endured in their final moments. In the water around the burning carriers, Japanese sailors faced an agonizing death. Those who had jumped from burning ships often found their clothes ablaze, the fuel oil on the water's surface igniting around them. Many drowned rather than burn, pulling themselves under the waves to escape the flames. Others trapped in compartments below the waterline faced the terrifying choice between drowning and burning as seawater and fire competed to claim them. The Americans, while victorious, paid their own terrible price. The loss of Torpedo Squadron 8 was particularly devastating. Of the 30 men who flew in the squadron, only 1 survived the battle. These were young men, many barely out of their teens, who had volunteered to serve their country and found themselves in the Pacific fighting for their lives against a determined and skilled enemy. Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, spent hours in the water, watching the battle unfold around him. He witnessed Japanese ships exploding, American aircraft being shot down, and men on both sides dying horrible deaths. His testimony provides a unique and harrowing perspective on the battle, describing the oil-slicked waters filled with debris, bodies, and the occasional survivor clinging to wreckage. The Battle of Midway marked the beginning of the end for Japanese expansion in the Pacific. The loss of 4 fleet carriers and their experienced air crews was a blow from which Japanese Navy never fully recovered. While Japan could replace the ships, they could never replace the pilots. These men had trained for years and had combat experience that was irreplaceable. Their deaths created a void in Japanese naval aviation that would become increasingly apparent as the war progressed. For the United States, Midway provided the first clear evidence that Japan could be defeated. The victory boosted American morale enormously and validated the strategy of using aircraft carriers as the primary striking force in the Pacific. It also demonstrated the value of intelligence, proving that superior information could overcome numerical disadvantage. The battle established the template for the island-hopping campaign that would follow. American forces had learned that they could successfully challenge Japanese naval supremacy, but they had also learned the terrible cost of such victories. The carnage at Midway foreshadowed the brutal battles to come at Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. The Pacific would see many more battles before Japan's surrender in 1945, but none would be more decisive than these 4 days in June 1942, when the fate of nations hung in the balance above a tiny atoll called Midway. Battle of Savo Island. The Battle of Savo Island, also known in Japanese sources as the First Battle of the Solomon Sea, was not just a defeat, it was a slaughter. It remains one of the most catastrophic naval disasters in U.S. history, eclipsed only by Pearl Harbor and sheer loss and shock. Just days before the battle, on August 7th, the United States had launched its first major amphibious assault of the Pacific War, the invasion of Guadalcanal, Tulagi, and Florida Island. Codenamed Operation Watchtower, the goal was simple, on paper. Deny the Japanese the chance to establish airfields that could threaten the supply routes between the US and Australia. But the Allies were green, barely recovered from the trauma of Pearl Harbor, and untested in large-scale amphibious warfare. The Japanese Empire, having rapidly expanded its defensive perimeter, was not about to give up the Solomons without a fight. Though they had been caught off guard by the landings, their response was swift, and it came with precision, darkness, and death. The Allied naval force guarded the approaches to the landing beaches. Under the overall command of British Rear Admiral Victor Crutchley, the force consisted of 5 heavy cruisers: USS Astoria, Quincy, Vincennes, HMAS Canberra, and USS Chicago, along with 2 light cruisers and several destroyers. However, the defenses were loosely organized and the command structure unclear. The entire force was worn thin from days of constant tension, poor rest, and inadequate communication. Most importantly, the Allied forces vastly underestimated the Japanese. The Imperial Japanese Navy dispatched a powerful task force under Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa, consisting of 7 cruisers and 1 destroyer. These ships, veterans of earlier campaigns, moved like assassins in the night. With better night optics, radar discipline, and years of experience in night fighting, the Japanese force steamed undetected through the darkened sea channels between the islands. Mikawa's force had spotted Allied ships during their advance, but was not detected in return. They had no air cover and risked daylight exposure the next morning. Still, they took the gamble, one that would pay off in blood. At approximately 1:43 a.m., the Japanese opened fire just northwest of Savo Island. The first victim was the Australian cruiser Canberra, which was hit by multiple shells and torpedoes in a matter of minutes. She lost power almost instantly. Crew members were trapped below decks as fires engulfed compartments, burning men alive or asphyxiating them in the choking smoke. The captain would later be found barely conscious, dying on the bridge, surrounded by corpses. Next came the American cruisers Astoria, Quincy, and Vincennes. All 3 were hit within a matter of minutes. The Japanese ships, firing accurately and rapidly, raked the cruisers with armor-piercing shells that tore through their steel like paper. Magazines exploded, turrets were decapitated. Oil-fed fires ignited inside the ships, cooking sailors alive or sending them overboard in panic, many of whom would die in the oily, flaming sea or be pulled under by suction as their ships went down in the dark sea. On the Quincy, chaos ensued. A shell hit near the bridge, killing most of the command staff instantly. The ship's guns returned fire, but in the confusion, some guns even targeted Astoria, a fellow U.S. cruiser. The bridge crew was decimated. The ship listed quickly, and by 2:35 a.m., Quincy had sunk stern first. She had lasted less than an hour. The Vincennes followed shortly thereafter, taking multiple shell hits that severed power and triggered internal fires. She too went down by 2:50 a.m. Astoria, though mortally wounded, clung to life until mid-morning, finally sinking at 12:16 p.m. after futile efforts to save her. In less than 2 hours, the Japanese had achieved one of the most lopsided victories in naval history. 4 heavy cruisers sunk, another heavily damaged, over 1,000 Allied sailors dead, and more than 700 wounded. The horror of Savo Island lies not just in the number of ships lost, but in how the men died. Survivors recalled jumping overboard into waters slick with burning oil, the surface of the sea ablaze. Screams came from the darkness, men burning alive in the water or trapped inside compartments as fire consumed everything around them. Explosions blew off limbs. Some sailors were incinerated before they even understood what had hit them. Others drowned in seconds, pulled under by the suction of the sinking holes or tangled in debris. Rescue efforts were hampered by confusion and the ever-present fear of more Japanese attacks. Shark attacks in the warm Solomon waters likely claimed some survivors who were left too long adrift. Bodies washed ashore for days following the battle. The sea reeked of oil, blood, and rot. The Battle of Savo Island was a disaster born of underestimation, complacency, and miscommunication. Many poor decisions led to this lopsided Japanese victory. There was poor coordination in the United States and Australian command. Rear Admiral Crutchley had left the immediate area hours before the attack to attend a meeting, taking his flagship with him and leaving a gap in leadership. No one informed the other ships of his departure. The Allied forces had severe radar limitations and lack of air reconnaissance. Unlike the Japanese, most Allied ships did not make effective use of radar. Even those with basic radar technology had operators who were poorly trained or unaware of what to look for. The Allies had not provided sufficient air cover or early warning reconnaissance flights. The Japanese sailed right past a seaplane patrol area without being detected. Plus, the Japanese had far superiority at night. The Japanese Imperial Navy had trained for years in night combat. Their lookouts used binoculars and visual targeting far superior to the green, exhausted Allied sailors trying to identify friend from foe in total darkness. Also, the Japanese had far superior torpedo effectiveness. The Japanese Type 93 Long Lance torpedoes were fast, long-range, and devastating. Allied ships took massive damage before they could even return effective fire. But perhaps most critically, the Allies simply never expected an attack that night. Many crew members were sleeping or at rest stations. The Japanese struck like assassins, fast and deadly. The surprise attack from the Japanese has led Allied Guadalcanal veterans to remember this naval engagement as the Battle of the Five Sitting Ducks, due to the 5 heavy cruisers being attacked without any warning. Though the Japanese could have pressed on to destroy the vulnerable troop transports anchored near Guadalcanal, they withdrew, fearing daylight air attacks. In retrospect, it was a missed opportunity, but for the Allies, the damage was already done. The defeat had a chilling psychological effect. It shook Allied confidence and exposed dangerous gaps in coordination, intelligence, and nighttime combat readiness. The waters around Savo Island would be dubbed Iron Bottom Sound due to the number of ships that would join the graveyard beneath its waves. Admirals were reassigned, doctrines were overhauled, and night combat training became a renewed priority, but the lessons came at a terrible cost. Today, the Battle of Savo Island remains one of the darkest nights in U.S. naval history. It is overshadowed by other famous battles like the Midway, Leyte Gulf, and Okinawa, but for those who served in the Solomons campaign, Savo Island was a waking nightmare. The wrecks still lie there, silent steel tombs on the seabed, each one a time capsule of a moment when the sea boiled with flame and men screamed into the night. It was the price of underestimation and the brutality of war at sea. Battle of the Philippine Sea. The morning of June 19, 1944, in the blue waters of the Philippine Sea, 2 mighty fleets prepared for what would become the final decisive carrier battle of the Pacific War. In the coming 48 hours, the skies above these tropical waters would witness the systematic destruction of Japanese naval aviation. A technological and tactical massacre so complete that American pilots would christen it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. This was to be the fifth and final major carrier versus carrier engagement between American and Japanese naval forces, a climatic duel that would forever end Japan's ability to propel air power across the vast Pacific. Admiral Jisaburo Uzawa's mobile fleet represented Japan's final hope for naval supremacy in the Pacific. 9 aircraft carriers, including the massive new flagship Taiho, carried the remnants of Japanese naval aviation into battle. 473 aircraft flown by pilots who were shadows of their predecessors. Gone were the veteran aviators who had struck Pearl Harbor and dominated the early months of the Pacific War. In their place sat young men with barely 100 hours of flight time, their hands trembling not from fear, but from inexperience as they gripped the controls of their Zeros, Judys, and Jills. The contrast with their American opponents was stark and deadly. Admiral Mark Mitcher's Task Force 58 deployed 15 fleet carriers and light carriers, their decks crowded with 956 aircraft flown by battle-hardened veterans. These American pilots had cut their teeth in the crucible of the Coral Sea, Midway, and the grinding campaigns of the Solomons. They flew superior aircraft, F-6F Hellcats that could outclimb, outdive, and outgun anything in the Japanese arsenal, and TBF Avengers carrying torpedoes and bombs that could crack open the largest of warships. More importantly, the Americans possessed a technological advantage that would prove decisive: the VT proximity fuse. This revolutionary device, one of war's most closely guarded secrets, allowed anti-aircraft shells to detonate near their targets rather than requiring direct hits. For Japanese pilots accustomed to flying through relatively ineffective defensive fire, the new fuses were 5 to 10 times more lethal than the counterpart. The battle began at 5:30 a.m., when American radar operators aboard the ships of Task Force 58 detected the first wave of incoming Japanese aircraft. 69 planes approaching from the west at an altitude of 24,000 feet. The electronic eyes of the American fleet had spotted the enemy at a distance of 150 miles, providing precious time to prepare for the reception. On carrier flight decks across the American fleet, organized chaos erupted as air crews rushed to launch defensive fighters. The USS Lexington's deck became a symphony of screaming engines and shouted orders as F-6F Hellcats were spotted for takeoff. Lieutenant Commander Charles Brewer, leading Fighting Squadron 16 from the Lexington, felt his heart hammering as he climbed into his Hellcat's cockpit. Around him, dozens of other fighters were spinning up, their Pratt & Whitney R2800 engines generating 2,000 horsepower each. The familiar ritual of pre-flight checks, fuel, oil pressure, magnetos, gun switches, provided a momentary calm before the storm of aerial combat that was about to engulf the Philippine Sea. The Japanese first wave, composed primarily of Judy dive bombers and Zero fighters, approached the American fleet in a formation that had once struck terror in Allied hearts. But as they closed to within 50 miles of the task force, they encountered something unprecedented: a carefully orchestrated wall of intercepting fighters directed by radar controllers with godlike vision of the battlefield. The slaughter began immediately. American Hellcats, climbing at nearly 3,000 feet per minute, tore into the Japanese formation with devastating effect. The superior performance of the American fighters became apparent within minutes. Where Japanese Zeros had to struggle to reach 20,000 feet, the Hellcats arrived fresh and fast, their 6 50 caliber machine guns spitting streams of armor-piercing incendiary rounds. Ensign Wilbur Spider Webb, flying from the USS Hornet, described his first encounter with a Japanese Judy dive bomber. "I came in from above and behind, maybe 200 yards out. The rear gunner was firing at me, but his little pop gun couldn't touch my Hellcat. I squeezed the trigger and my 650s just tore them apart. The whole tail section disintegrated and the plane went into a flat spin. I could see the pilot trying to get out, but he didn't have a chance, he said. Japanese aviator Petty Officer Kiyoshi Nagao, flying a Zero from the carrier Zoikaku, found himself completely outmatched in his first combat mission. He said, quote, "The American fighters were everywhere. They were faster, they climbed better, and their pilots seemed to know exactly where we were going to be. I saw 6 of my squadron mates shot down in the first 10 minutes. The sky was full of burning planes, most of them ours," unquote. As the morning progressed, wave after wave of Japanese aircraft approached the American fleet, only to be systematically destroyed by the deadly combination of superior fighters and revolutionary anti-aircraft fire. The proximity-fused shells created a nightmare of exploding metal that no Japanese pilot had ever experienced. Aboard the Japanese carrier Taiho, Admiral Ozawa watched in growing horror as his carefully hoarded aircraft disappeared from the radar screens. Radio chatter, once filled with the confident voices of attacking pilots, became a litany of death calls and desperate requests for assistance. The human cost of the aerial massacre was staggering, and not all deaths were quick. Some Japanese pilots, their aircraft crippled but still flyable, attempted desperate kamikaze attacks on American ships. These early suicide missions, born of desperation rather than doctrine, were largely ineffective against the wall of defensive fire. Seaman First Class Robert Martinez, manning a 40mm gun aboard the destroyer USS Stockton, watched a damaged Zero attempt to crash into his ship. He said, quote, "The pilot was clearly wounded. I could see blood on his flight suit. The plane was trailing smoke and losing pieces, but he kept coming straight at us. We hit him with everything we had. When he finally crashed into the sea about 50 yards away, the explosion sent burning fuel across the water. It was horrible, but he would have killed us all if we'd let him through," unquote. While the aerial battle raged overhead, another drama was unfolding beneath the waves. American submarines, positioned along the expected Japanese approach routes, waited like mechanical sharks for their opportunity to strike. The USS Albacore, commanded by Commander James Blanchard, had been tracking the Japanese fleet since dawn, maneuvering for an attack on the enemy carriers. At 9:10 a.m., Blanchard achieved the perfect firing position. Through his periscope, he could see the massive bulk of the carrier Taiho, her flight deck crowded with aircraft preparing for launch. The torpedo room filled with a hiss of compressed air as 6 Mark 14 torpedoes streaked toward their target. One torpedo found its mark, striking Taiho amidship. The explosion killed dozens of sailors instantly, their bodies torn apart by the detonation of the 600-pound warhead. In the carrier's aviation fuel storage compartments, volatile gasoline began leaking from ruptured pipes, creating an invisible cloud of death that permeated the ship's ventilation system. The air itself became poisonous, and men were collapsing from the fumes. For 6 hours, Taiho's crew fought desperately to contain the spreading fuel vapors, but their efforts were doomed. At 3:32 p.m., the accumulated gasoline finally found an ignition source. The explosion that destroyed Taiho was visible from 50 miles away. The 37,000-ton carrier simply disintegrated, her hull breaking apart as aviation fuel and ammunition magazines detonated in a chain reaction of devastating power. Of the 2,150 men aboard, fewer than 500 survived the initial explosion. Those who had made it into the water faced a new horror. The sea around the sinking carrier was covered with a thick layer of burning fuel oil that turned rescue attempts into death traps. As Japanese aircraft continued their futile attacks throughout the day, American pilots began to display the confidence of apex predators. The kill ratio was so lopsided that some Hellcat pilots claimed multiple victories on single sorties. Lieutenant Alexander Verashu of Fighting Squadron 16 shot down 6 Japanese aircraft in 8 minutes, his gun camera recording the systematic destruction of an entire dive bomber formation. It was like target practice, Verashu later recalled. The Japanese pilots were brave, but they simply didn't have the training or the equipment to compete. I felt sorry for them, but this was war. Every one of them shot down was one less enemy who could attack our ships or kill our troops, he said. The psychological impact on surviving Japanese aviators was devastating. Those few who managed to return to their carriers brought reports of unimaginable carnage. The confident young men who had launched the morning returned as hollow-eyed survivors, many so traumatized that they could barely speak coherently about what they had witnessed. Squadron leader Tadashi Nakajima, returning to the carrier Junyo after losing 8 of his 12 pilots, filed a report that captured the hopelessness of Japan's situation. He said, quote, "The Americans have achieved total air superiority. Their fighters are superior to ours in every category. Their pilots are better trained, and their anti-aircraft fire is impossibly effective. We cannot win an aerial battle under these conditions. We can only die bravely." Unquote. As darkness fell on June 19th, Admiral Mitcher faced a crucial decision. American reconnaissance had finally located the retreating Japanese fleet, but attacking at extreme range in fading daylight would be extraordinarily dangerous. Many aircraft would not have enough fuel to return to their carriers, and night landings were among the most hazardous operations in naval aviation. Mitcher made the bold decision to launch a full strike. At 4:21 p.m., 216 American aircraft, Hellcats, Helldivers, and Avengers roared off the decks of Task Force 58 of what would become known as the Mission Beyond Darkness. The pilots knew they were flying into a potential death trap, but the opportunity to finish off the Japanese carrier force was too valuable to ignore. Lieutenant Commander James Ramage, leading a squadron of SB-2C Helldivers from the USS Enterprise, felt the weight of responsibility as his formation approached the enemy fleet in the gathering dusk. "We could see the Japanese ships spread out below us like toys on a bathtub," he said. Their anti-aircraft fire was coming up in streams of colored tracers, beautiful and deadly at the same time. We knew that many of us wouldn't make it home, but we had a job to do. The American attack achieved devastating results. The carrier Hiyo, struck by multiple torpedo and bomb hits, erupted in a massive fireball that could be seen for over 100 miles. The explosion was so violent that it lifted aircraft off the flight deck and hurled them into the sea like toys. Of Hiyo's crew of 1,200, only 237 survived. Aviation radioman second class George Walsh, flying a rear gunner in a TBF Avenger, witnessed the carrier's destruction. "She went up like a Roman candle," he said. "One second she was there, shooting at us with everything she had, and the next second she was just a column of fire reaching up to the clouds. The heat from the explosion could be felt in our cockpit, even though we were over 1,000 feet away." The return journey became an epic of courage and tragedy. As American aircraft struggled back toward their carriers in complete darkness, many ran out of fuel and were forced to ditch in the shark-infested waters of the Philippine Sea. Others, disoriented by the darkness and the stress of combat, flew in circles until their engines finally quit. Admiral Mitcher made another crucial decision that saved hundreds of lives. Despite the risk of submarine attack, he ordered all ships in the task force to turn on their lights, creating a beacon for the returning aircraft. The sight of those lights, blazing across miles of dark ocean, brought tears to the eyes of exhausted pilots who had given up hope of survival. Even with the lighted ships to guide them, many aircraft crashed attempting night landings on pitch and carrier decks. Flight deck crews worked with desperate efficiency to clear wrecked planes and rescue injured aviators. The darkness was filled with the sound of aircraft engines, shouted orders, and the screams of wounded men being carried to sickbay. Ensign Donald Lewis, attempting to land his damaged Hellcat aboard the USS Yorkton, described the experience. He said, quote, "I was running on fumes and could barely see the carrier deck. The landing signal officer was trying to wave me in, but my depth perception was shot from exhaustion and combat stress. I came in too high and too fast, caught the number 10 wire, and slammed into the barrier. The next thing I knew, corpsmen were pulling me out of the wreckage. I was lucky. The pilot behind me missed all the wires and went over the side." End quote. When dawn broke on June 21st, the magnitude of American victory became clear. In 2 days of fighting, the Japanese had lost over 600 aircraft and 3 aircraft carriers, along with nearly 3,000 irreplaceable pilots and aircrew. American losses were comparatively minimal, 123 aircraft and 109 men killed. The kill ratio was nearly 20-1 in favor of the Americans, a margin of superiority unprecedented in the annals of air warfare. More importantly, the Battle of the Philippine Sea had permanently crippled Japanese naval aviation. The mobile fleet still possessed 6 aircraft carriers, but they were now little more than floating airports without planes or pilots. Japan's ability to conduct offensive carrier operations had been eliminated forever, reducing the Imperial Navy to a defensive force incapable of challenging American expansion across the Pacific. The psychological impact was equally devastating. Japanese naval commanders, who had once planned to achieve decisive victory through superior fighting spirit, now faced the reality that American technological and tactical superiority had made such victory impossible. The myth of Japanese invincibility in the air, carefully cultivated since Pearl Harbor, lay in ruins on the floor of the Philippine Sea. For the young Americans who participated in the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, the victory was both triumphant and sobering. Many had witnessed the wholesale slaughter of an enemy air force, watching human beings die in flames and terror. The clinical efficiency with which they had destroyed their opponents would haunt some for the rest of their lives. Lieutenant Charles Brewer, who had shot down 4 Japanese aircraft on June 19, reflected on the experience decades later. He said, quote, "We celebrated that night. We had to. It was such a complete victory, but I kept thinking about those Japanese pilots, most of them kids just like us. They were brave men fighting for their country, just on the wrong side of history and technology. There was nothing glorious about watching them die." Unquote. The Battle of the Philippine Sea marked the end of an era in naval warfare. Never again would massive carrier fleets clash in decisive battle, their aircraft filling the sky in life-or-death struggles for aerial supremacy. The age of the great carrier battles, Coral Sea, Midway, Eastern Solomons, Santa Cruz Islands, and finally, the Philippine Sea, had come to an end with American victory so complete that no future challenge was possible. The vast waters of the Philippine Sea, which had witnessed this climactic aerial battle, returned to their peaceful blue expanse. But beneath those waves lay the broken remains of Japanese aircraft and the bones of young men who had flown too far from home. Their sacrifice, along with the skill and courage of their American opponents, had written the final chapter in the story of carrier versus carrier combat in the Pacific War. In the end, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot was more than just a military victory. It was the moment when American industrial might, technological innovation, and tactical superiority converged to achieve total dominance in the Pacific. The young pilots who flew through these deadly skies had not merely won a battle, they had ended forever Japan's dreams of empire and opened the final path to Tokyo Bay. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, 4 days of unprecedented carnage that would claim the lives of over 13,000 men and send countless steel titans to their watery graves. This battle stands as history's largest naval engagement, a brutal testament to both human courage and the horrific machinery of modern warfare. By October 1944, the Japanese Empire was dying, its once mighty combined fleet reduced to a shadow of its former glory. Yet like a cornered beast, Admiral Soimu Toyoda's remaining naval forces prepared for one last desperate gambit. Operation Shogo 1 represented Japan's final attempt to break American naval supremacy in the Pacific. A complex, multi-pronged assault designed to annihilate the U.S. invasion forces at Leyte and deal a crippling blow to Admiral Chester Nimitz's Pacific Fleet. The Japanese plan was audacious in its complexity. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force would punch through the San Bernardino Strait with 4 battleships, including the massive Yamato and Musashi, floating fortresses armed with 18-inch guns capable of hurling gigantic shells. Meanwhile, Admiral Soji Nishimura's southern force would strike through Surigao Strait, and Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's northern force would act as bait, using their precious remaining aircraft carriers to lure Admiral William Bull Halsey's powerful Third Fleet away from the landing beaches. What followed was not a single battle, but 4 distinct engagements that would transform the Western Pacific into a maritime graveyard spanning thousands of square miles of blood-stained ocean. The killing began in the pre-dawn darkness of October 23rd when 2 American submarines, the USS Darter and USS Dace, detected the massive silhouettes of Kurita's center force slicing through the Palawan Passage. Lieutenant Commander David McClintock, peering through his periscope aboard the Darter, watched in fascination as the enemy's fleet approached. It was like watching a parade of giants, he would later recall. At 5:32 a.m., both submarines unleashed their deadly cargo. Torpedoes carrying 600 pounds of explosive warhead each streaked through the dark waters at 46 knots. The first salvo struck Admiral Kurita's flagship, the heavy cruiser Atago, with devastating effect. The massive warship, displaced by multiple torpedo strikes, began her death roll within minutes as seawater flooded her compartments. Below decks on the Atago, Japanese sailors found themselves trapped in a nightmare of rushing water, twisted steel, and absolute darkness. The lucky ones drowned quickly. Others were crushed by collapsing bulkheads or scalded by superheated steam from ruptured pipes. Admiral Kurita himself barely escaped, leaping into the oil-slicked sea as his flagship disappeared beneath the waves, taking 360 of her crew to the bottom. The heavy cruiser Maya suffered an even more gruesome fate. A single torpedo strike detonated her magazines, creating a fireball visible for miles. The explosion was so violent that it vaporized entire sections of the ship, leaving scattered debris and human remains floating in an expanding circle of burning fuel oil. Of Maya's 1,000-man crew, fewer than 300 survived to be pulled from the shark-infested waters. October 24th brought the first major surface engagement as American carrier aircraft from Task Force 38 descended upon Kurita's battered center force like mechanical vultures. The target that drew their primary attention was the Musashi. At 73,000 tons, one of the largest battleships ever constructed, her 18-inch armor belt theoretically impenetrable to conventional attack. Wave after wave of American dive bombers and torpedo planes hurled themselves at the giant battleship in a methodical dismantling that would take the entire day. Commander Hugh Winters, piloting a Helldiver dive bomber, described the scene. Quote, "She was like a wounded whale surrounded by sharks. Every hit sent up geysers of smoke and flame, but she just kept absorbing punishment." End quote. The Musashi's crew of 2,400 men endured a hell beyond imagination as their ship slowly died around them. Each torpedo strike sent shockwaves through the massive hull, rupturing pipes, shorting electrical systems, and trapping men in flooded compartments. In the lower decks, sailors worked frantically in waist-deep water, using emergency lighting to guide their desperate damage control efforts. The air grew thick with smoke and oil fumes. By afternoon, the Musashi had absorbed an incredible punishment: 19 torpedo hits and 17 bomb strikes. Her massive superstructure was a twisted ruin of steel and flame, her forward gun turrets unable to fire, and her hull listing heavily to port. Yet she still fought on, her remaining anti-aircraft guns spitting defiance at the circling American planes. The end came at 7:35 p.m., with her list approaching 30 degrees. Captain Toshihira Inoguchi gave the order to abandon ship. Men poured from hatches and shattered portholes, many already injured, others carrying wounded shipmates. The Musashi's death throes were spectacular and terrible, her massive hull breaking apart as she rolled over, crushing men who had not swum far enough away. The sea around her was littered with debris, lifeboats, and the oil-covered bodies of the dead and dying. Over 1,000 sailors went down with their ship. While the Musashi fought her dying battle, Admiral Jesse Oldendorf was preparing a deadly welcome for Admiral Nishimura's southern force at Surigao Strait. In one of naval history's last battleship versus battleship encounters, Oldendorf deployed his forces in a classic T formation, allowing his 6 battleships, including several Pearl Harbor veterans like the USS West Virginia and USS Pennsylvania, to bring their full broadside firepower to bear on the approaching Japanese column. The night battle that erupted was a hellscape of muzzle flashes, searchlight beams, and exploding shells. The Japanese destroyer Michishio, caught in the crossfire of multiple American battleships, disintegrated under the weight of incoming fire. Survivors later described the scene as apocalyptic. The ship didn't sink, it ceased to exist. One moment it was there, the next it was just floating debris and burning fuel, said one sailor. The battleship Yamashiro absorbed dozens of hits from the 14 and 16-inch shells, each projectile weighing over a ton and capable of penetrating 3 feet of steel armor. The bridge was obliterated by a direct hit, killing Nishimura instantly. Below decks, the ship's crew fought a losing battle against flooding and fire as shell after shell punched through the hull, each impact creating devastating secondary explosions of ammunition and fuel. The carnage was methodical and devastating. Of the 7 Japanese ships that entered Surigao Strait, only 1 destroyer escaped. The rest were sent to the bottom, taking nearly 4,000 Japanese sailors with them. The narrow waterway became a graveyard of steel and corpses, the water so thick with oil and debris that rescue operations were nearly impossible. Perhaps the most dramatic engagement of the 4-day battle occurred off Samar Island, where a small force of American escort carriers and destroyers designated Taffy 3 under Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague found themselves face-to-face with Admiral Kurita's still powerful center force, including the mighty Yamato. The disparity in firepower was staggering. Kurita's force included 4 battleships, 8 cruisers, and 11 destroyers, a combined striking power that could obliterate Sprague's small escort carriers and their thin-skinned escorts within minutes. The American ships were designed for anti-submarine warfare and ground support, not slugging it out with battleships. What followed was a David vs. Goliath struggle that would become legendary. Commander Ernest Evans of the destroyer USS Johnston made the crucial decision to charge directly at the Japanese battle line. A 2,100-ton destroyer attacking ships 10 times her size. "This is going to be a fighting ship," Evans announced over the ship's intercom. "I'm going in." The Johnston's suicidal charge inspired other American destroyers to follow suit. These small ships, armed with 5-inch guns that could barely dent a battleship's armor, closed to point-blank range and unleashed their torpedoes while absorbing devastating punishment. The Johnston took dozens of hits from Japanese cruiser fire, her bridge destroyed, her steering gear shattered, and her hull perforated by countless shell holes. Aboard the Johnston, the crew fought on despite impossible odds. Sailors manning the gun mounts continued firing even as Japanese shells exploded around them, filling the air with lethal shrapnel. In the engineering spaces, men worked waist-deep in scalding water and steam, desperately trying to keep the ship's engines running. The wounded were treated on deck because the sick bay had been destroyed by shell fire. Commander Evans, his left hand nearly severed by shrapnel, continued directing his ship's attack from the bridge wing until a large caliber shell finally found its mark. The Johnston rolled over and sank, taking Evans and 185 of his crew with her. But their sacrifice had not been vain. The aggressive American destroyer attack had thrown the Japanese formation into confusion, buying precious time for the escort carriers to escape. The individual stories of courage and horror from Leyte Gulf are endless. Aboard the escort carrier USS Gambier Bay, the only American carrier sunk during the battle, sailors worked frantically to launch their aircraft even as Japanese shells crashed through the flight deck. aviation machinist mate Albert Rosner continued fueling planes until the very end, his body found at his post when the ship was abandoned. The casualty statistics tell only part of the story. When the 4-day battle finally ended on October 26, the human cost was staggering. Over 10,000 Japanese dead versus approximately 3,000 Americans. But behind each number was a personal tragedy. A sailor who would never see his family again, a young pilot whose aircraft became his tomb, a damage control man who died trying to save the ship. The psychological toll on survivors was equally devastating. Many men who lived through the battle carried the trauma for the rest of their lives. Sleep brought nightmares of burning ships and drowning shipmates. Some never recovered from what they had witnessed in those terrible 4 days. Despite the horrific casualties, Leyte Gulf represented a decisive American victory that effectively ended Japanese naval power in the Pacific. The combined fleet ceased to exist as an effective fighting force, having lost 4 aircraft carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers, along with most of their irreplaceable experienced pilots and sailors. The battle also marked the first significant use of organized kamikaze attacks, as desperate Japanese commanders turned to suicide tactics in a last attempt to stem the American advance. These human-guided missiles added a new dimension of horror to naval warfare, as American sailors watched enemy aircraft deliberately crash into their ships, bringing death and destruction through the ultimate sacrifice of their pilots. For the Americans, Leyte Gulf secured the Philippine Islands and opened the path to Japan itself. The victory came at a terrible price, not just in ships and lives, but in the psychological burden carried by those who witnessed the industrial-scale slaughter of modern naval warfare. The Battle of Leyte Gulf stands as a watershed moment in naval history, the last great clash of battleship fleets and the final decisive engagement between surface forces in the Pacific War. It demonstrated both the magnificent courage of sailors on both sides and the horrific destructive power of 20th century naval warfare. Thanks for watching. This has been Deadliest Disasters. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. That's the best way to help our channel grow. And if you want to buy me a cup of coffee, check the link in the description or on our channel page. Thank you.